Welcome back to Chess Titans YouTube. In the last video, we discussed strategies for the squire pawn replacement. And in this video, we're going to discuss the strategies for the mimic chess replacement. This is arguably one of the most powerful pawns, but it has a lot of disadvantages too. And we're going to talk about that. The goal of Chess Titans, if you haven't been here before, you're new to this channel and you're new to the game, go ahead and give it a download. It's just like traditional chess, but you can upgrade pieces into new pieces. So for example, you can upgrade your pawn into an assassin or a squire or a mimic. And all these pieces have different abilities. So like the squire can move at an angle and attack forward, different from a traditional pawn that moves forward and attacks at an angle. All the pieces are built to be on the same level relatively. So all of these pieces, for example, are all worth 1 point in the game and should be about even on a playing field. But they open up completely new strategies for every piece that you use. So let's talk about the mimic and what makes it different. And then we're also going to talk about the strategies that you can use with the mimic to beat your opponents. So the mimic is interesting because it can move at an angle to the right or to the left. So it's very mobile, very agile on the board versus a pawn that can only move forward. This is kind of similar to a squire, but the difference is the mimic attacks to the side. So the mimic is much more limited and much harder to actually get into a position to attack an opponent versus a pawn or a squire or an assassin that attacks these forward squares. The mimic has to get next to another piece in order to attack. Well, what makes it so great is that when the mimic takes a piece, it turns into that piece. So if this mimic is able to take a queen, then the mimic turns into the queen. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. First, we'll continue talking about the movement patterns because the other unique thing about a mimic is off the starting line, the mimic can only move forward 1 square. This is much different than all 3 of the other pawn replacement pieces. Pawn, squire, assassin can all move 2 squares off the starting line, where the mimic can only move 1. This gives it a lot less of an advantage. And these disadvantages are because it's so powerful that it kind of evens it out. If the mimic is able to take a queen, that's a game-changing move. So let's say you're in the situation here where the mimic you have your mimic set up, you're kind of opening your lines, and the queen takes your mimic here. Well, the next step is the mimic is so dangerous because the mimic can potentially take this high-level piece, can take this queen. And so what happens is as soon as the mimic takes that piece, it turns into that piece. So you immediately gain a queen, now you have 2 queens. Where this also is interesting is, like, let's say your opponent is using a different piece than yours. So for example, let's say that your opponent is not using a queen here, but they're using a phoenix. The queen is using, your opponent's using a phoenix and the mimic takes, then your piece will turn into a phoenix. So once the mimic takes, your mimic will go away and turn into a phoenix. So this is this is a situation where you have a phoenix and a traditional queen because your mimic turns into whatever the opponent is using. So if you take a piece like a queen with mimic, complete game changer. But also, if your mimic can take any other piece that's worth more than 1 point, if you can take a bishop level piece, a knight level piece, or a rook level piece, you're still in a game changing position here. It's almost like you're leveling up your advantage if you were to take one of these pieces in traditional chess and you're up by 3 points. It's similar here. If your mimic's able to take one of these pieces, then you lose a mimic, but you're up a powerful piece. So that is the advantage of the mimic, and we're going to go into a couple of different strategies of what this could look like. So you start off, your mimics all in a line. When you replace a mimic, you replace all your pawns with mimics. And let's do a quick review. The mimic has limited starting movement and struggles to attack because they can only attack sideways. So off the line and forward, they can only move up 1 square at a time. However, if the mimic can take a piece that can be game-changing shift in momentum. And lastly, if the mimic reaches the back line, it can change into any piece that you decide, which is any piece that you decide of your line that you have here. So for example, if you're using a phoenix, you can change your mimic into a phoenix. If you're using a dragon instead of a bishop, then you can change your mimic into a dragon if it hits the back line. This is true for any pawn level piece. No matter what pawn level piece you're using, if it reaches the back line, you're going to be able to change into whatever piece you want, which is pretty great. And it's the same for traditional pawn as well. So let's go ahead and cover some strategies with the mimic. So the first strategy is a fork, similar to a traditional pawn fork. But there are some differences in the mimic fork versus a traditional pawn fork. So the mimic forks by having two pieces to the side of it. So let's say the mimic was here, you move here to create this fork between the bishop and the knight in this case. Now the cool thing about this is when the mimic takes in this fork, the mimic is going to turn into whatever piece that it takes. So it's not just capturing material, you're gaining a really great advantage. The cool thing about this too is, let's say that instead of a bishop being here, let's say that it's a rook. Normally, if this was a pawn that was forking, and the pawn's here and forking both these right here, you would most likely decide to move your rook out of the way and let your knight be taken, because your knight is traditionally seen as the worst piece relative to the rook, not as powerful. But in this case, your opponent may want to just take your mimic and sacrifice the rook so that you don't gain that advantage of a new piece. So it's really interesting strategy dynamics from the opponent's side here of what they decide to do, because they're either going to take this and remove their rook, or they're going to have to move this out of the way and just let the opponent take this piece. So it's a really interesting, unique style of strategy that you're creating here when you're using the mimic. The mimic is just so powerful if you can get it into a fork position. And if it's a example like done previously, where it's these two pieces here, the bishop wouldn't even need to be here. They move out of the way, and you're able to take a knight and change into that knight. So that's the advantage of the mimic from a fork perspective. And there's other strategies too. The next strategy that we want to cover is mimic pairing. So if your mimic are in pairs, they're incredibly powerful. They create this wall. You cannot take a mimic pair without the mimic changing into whatever you took with. So for example, as you're moving along, if you move your mimic here, your next move might want to be to move your mimic here. And then you're leaving these two without pairs, so you might want to eventually move here, move here. The reason that you're doing this, the reason that you're creating this mimic wall, is because any chance that they have to take a mimic, you'll be able to immediately take back and turn into that piece. So it almost creates a limiting factor of the opponent can take a piece, but it's not just a one-for-one trade-off. You're giving the opponent, if your opponent takes, they're giving you that piece that you can change into. So mimic, very, very powerful piece when in pairs. And what you do from an opponent's perspective is you want your pawn level piece to be able to take these pieces. That's where pawn, assassin, squire are all great attackers for this, because the mimic can only take side to side. So a pawn moving here is threatening this mimic here. If you're using something like a squire, if you're using something like a squire, then the squire is attacking this mimic here. So traditional pawns, the squire and the assassin all have the ability to attack the mimics in a way that's pretty difficult for them to defend. So if you were in a situation like this, maybe this mimic would get out of the way, and the result of this mimic getting out of the way is the assassin is now under attack, and the assassin would want to move to a different square. And this may go on like this, and at this point the assassin is pinned because the assassin moves or is walled off because the assassin can't move to either of these squares, so inevitably you can take. And the good thing is, from the opponent's perspective, if a mimic takes a pawn level piece, then the mimic just turns into that same pawn level piece. So it's not too detrimental. It's almost like if the mimic were to take this piece and stay as a mimic, it's kind of the same. They're all relatively about the same level. The thing with the mimic is the strategies that you can create and the game-changing moves you can make with the mimic are just so powerful in a game of Chess Titans. If you haven't yet, go ahead and give Chess Titans a download. It's on the App Store or on Google Play. Like this video if it gave you any value, and remember to subscribe. We're going to be posting new strategies every week for Chess Titans. We're going to be going over every single piece on the game, and if you're wondering how many pieces that is, it's a lot of pieces. Every piece has its own unique abilities. When you upgrade, it creates entirely new strategies in the game of Chess Titans. We can't wait to show you all the different strategies that we've come up with, and we want to play you in Chess Titans so we can see what strategies that you come up with. Enjoy Chess Titans. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you in the next one.